Welcome back to the 10,000 Heroes Show. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight. This is season 6, and get ready, everybody, because season 6 is where we recognize not only the inevitability of conflict, but we see its transcendent potential. That's right. The only way out is through. Hey everybody, today's episode is an interview with April Rinne. So it's different than the last few episodes of solo casts I've been doing. And April Rinne, her whole thing is flux. So it's dealing with uncertainty, change, being in the moment. She has this whole doctrine of the flux mindset and these 8 different superpowers, which I really encourage you to check out. We don't get into all of those details in this interview because we're really flowing in the flux. And we talked a lot about her life and her development and how she got to this point, which was being forced to deal with a huge amount of uncertainty at a really young age. And you'll hear about that in the episode. So it was a fantastic conversation. I barely edited it. I just wanted to stick with the flow of it. But I do want to make a couple notes. One is we mentioned Abby in the episode because it's Abby who connected us. And we're talking about Abby Falick, who's a previous guest on the podcast, I think over a year ago, maybe an episode in the 20s. So feel free to check that out. That's a great episode as well. And an errata correction. I said I was 42. Turns out I was actually 43. I'm now 44, but I don't want to be misrepresenting my age. And there's a lot in this interview that goes into kind of both of our backgrounds, and I kind of expose some of my background a little bit more. So if you're interested in that, great. If not, give me that feedback and I will take it. So thank you very much and enjoy the show.
I was born and raised in San Francisco. My parents were hippies. And it sounds like when your parents moved to Washington, my parents moved to Colorado.
Okay.
As you're giving the story, I'm like, right. And I joked that they were hippies, but they were a little bit older. So my mom growing up, saw a lot of bras being burned, but my mom didn't burn her bra kind of thing.
Okay.
And I think if she had been born 5 years, definitely 10 years later, but even 5 years later, she would not have gotten married. She would not have had kids. She was born in this kind of cusp of be as independent as you want. And when push comes to shove, you're still going to go kind of the traditional route of marriage and family and so forth. But then my parents wanted to be closer to nature, and they had met in the Bay Area. That was the only place they'd ever really known. And so when I was in middle school, we moved to Colorado, and in a place that was very, very progressive at the time, and now is known as a hotbed for Christian evangelicals.
Okay. Where in Colorado is that?
Colorado Springs.
That's a little bit south of Denver?
It's south of Denver. Yeah. And my family now, we can talk about this. My parents are long past. But
I saw that on there's a post in LinkedIn.
Yeah. Well, and that's a part of my story. I mean, I was looking at your whole thing about not just heroes and whatnot, but how does my work on flux and what do you do when you don't know what to do? And where do you turn when it's the fan, and not just the last 3 years, in general. And that's when I look back and go, when did I get interested in this theme? It's when my whole world flipped upside down. And it was never about a book. And what's interesting is until the last few years, most people don't know that about my history. They don't know that piece of my life. And I've never shied away from it. I've always been a totally open book about it. I've actually wanted to talk about it, but for many years, it was really hard to do that in a way that didn't make other people run away and didn't make them freak out of are you going to be okay? Oh my gosh. Right. And so the work that I do, in the world of futurism and social enterprise and how I met Abby, has nothing to do with my parents, nothing to do with grief and loss. But then when I add that into this is what drives me, is the fundamentally human experience of uncertainty. And that can be personal or professional or organizational or civilizational these days, right? We don't know where we're heading as humanity. It all kind of comes together, and it's much easier for me to put my parents' experience and that tragedy and that process, I can now place it in a much, much bigger landscape. It's not the painting itself. It's a part of the painting. It's a detail of the painting. But anyway, so Colorado Springs, yes, it's about an hour south of Denver. It's where Pikes Peak is. It's where Colorado College is, which is this
Right.
super
I've heard of
awesome.
that. Yeah.
Right. So I grew up basically a mile from the Colorado College campus. And my parents were super progressive. And back in the, so in the 90s, it was super progressive. Well, late 80s, all the way until the mid 90s, it was super progressive. And then I don't know what the year was. I was gone. I had gone to college, but it was in the 90s, late 90s, that Focus on the Family had
Oh,
they
I
moved
remember
so
that.
they moved their headquarters there because the city of, I don't know the details. I wasn't living there at the time, but my parents were. Um, it was shortly before they died, actually. And I often wonder, like, if my parents had lived, they definitely wouldn't be living in Colorado Springs anymore, I don't think. But yeah, they got really cheap land, a big tax break, and all sorts of whatever. But they established their global headquarters just outside of Colorado Springs. And that was the beginning of what became, I think, at its high water point, I don't know what the number is today, but I remember at some point hearing that there were 273 religious organizations with evangelical roots that had presence in Colorado Springs.
Wow.
So it's like, wow, that's the different place. So I always have to give the caveat of, like, the San Francisco I grew up in is not the San Francisco of today. The Colorado Springs I grew up in is not the Colorado Springs of today.
Yeah.
But here we are. Anyway,
Wow.
back to, yeah, sort of origin stories and coming full circle, it sounds like. And actually, this is just it is a fun, very meaningful footnote for me. People are often like, why are you in Portland? Like, a lot of people think I, like, escaped San Francisco or something. I'm like, oh, no, 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 no. This was, like, written in my stars when I was 20, but I just never thought it would happen. So I have one older biological sister. And when my parents died, I was in England. I got that phone call, like, halfway around the world of, like, are you sitting down and then have to come home? My one older sister was living in Portland, Oregon. So she had graduated from college. And so it's a longer story, but I had to take time out of college. Life flipped upside down. My sister and I were not close, but we were all we had left. And we had to figure out how to redefine our relationship. And she said to me, neither one of us wanted to be in Colorado. We didn't want this accident, right? So we were like, what do we do? And she was like, I'm going to Portland and you need to come with me.
Wow.
But she said, I'm not your mom. You can't live with me. You have to get your own feet on the ground, but we have to be close enough that we can grieve together and figure out what we're going to do together. Which, if you think about the emotional intelligence, the emotional maturity of, I was 20, she was 23, 24. I think about that. And she was just profoundly, like, present. And so I moved to Portland. We'd always had relatives here, so it wasn't a place I was completely unfamiliar with, but I didn't know anybody except for my sister and my cousins. And, when I was 20, I spent the deepest, darkest chapter of my life in Portland, and I fell head and over heels for it. And I was like, this is where I'm coming back. Like, mark my words. I thought it would be when I retired or something someday, but because I wanted an international career at that time. And so the last place I needed to be was Portland. Like, San Francisco was provincial. At that point in time, Portland, like, you would not go to Portland for an international career for anything. And so it was many years later, after obviously the world of work changed and what I was doing changed, and had lived overseas for a long time, and Portland came back. But like you, but in a different way. But I hear, I resonate with what you're saying of, like, sometimes people like, you went where? It's like, no, it was written in the stars a while ago. It took me a long time to see that full constellation, but to be back kind of where you belong. Not that there's only one place that one belongs, I think, but to be back in a place where you feel like you can be you, but also bring something unique to those around you.
Yeah, I mean, that describes so perfectly my experience here. It's crazy how when I travel now, I feel, I mean, I spent 15 years after graduating from college just traveling. And now when I travel, I really feel almost this, like, level of discomfort of, like, oh, where are my mountains? Especially if I go to a place that doesn't have mountains and doesn't have ocean, because we have mountains in the ocean here. I really feel like I'm not as comfortable as I normally am without this landscape. which is such a, I never thought I would feel that way. And
Mm-hmm.
it's totally true that what I do here is so different than everyone else that I can feel like the edges of my little piece of the puzzle for this community. And it's like, there I am.
Yeah. Isn't that a blessing? And do you also, when you travel, I'm guessing like the joy and the delight and the expanded horizons of travel, and also the like, and I still look forward to going home. I
Yeah.
still like find me that place with the mountains and the ocean and I joke, I don't think it's just that saying of like there's something in the water, there's something in the air. And in the case of the Olympic Peninsula, I would say like literally, yeah, it's some of the cleanest air on earth. And there's just something that you can't, it's like the magic fairy dust.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not the same for each person. And I would never judge where someone else wants to live or places that they feel at home or whatever. But when you find that place, I think I've actually, as I've gotten older, I've met quite a few people who, and the best way to put it is like they're still looking for that place. And sometimes they grew up in one place, and sometimes they grew up as the kid of a diplomat all over the world, and it's random. But you realize that finding that place, even if it's not where you get to live your whole life, knowing what that place is, going back to that place is such a gift that, and I even joke, it sounds like you perhaps as well, like one foot is always, I think, I mean, anything can change, we know that, but like my intention, one foot will always be in Portland.
Mm-hmm.
That foot might be any place on the planet at any given point in time, but having the knowledge and the comfort of, especially when so many things are unstable, that the stability of like one foot intentionally will be in your community is just a real gift.
Yeah.
It's not something I thought, sounds like both of us. I didn't expect to have that when I was growing up. I thought I was
Yeah.
going to be opposite on the spectrum. I was
Yeah,
going
and
to,
it's kind of an archaic notion for people in like a very postmodern world of like, oh, it's almost like this romanticism of the peasant of being like, oh, tied to this community and this land that I felt like I always wanted, but I never thought was there for me because of just the way my family's from India. I was born in California. I moved a couple times as a kid, spent
yeah,
almost 2 decades just traveling every 6 months. But I really have that, for better
yeah.
or for worse. It's like I can't escape it now.
Well, and I'm curious, and I know we need to dive into a range of conversations. So I'm like, I love doing podcasts. And I'm always like, I'm in your hands. So if we need to pivot and get started or whatever, that's totally fine. I
Oh,
just have one.
let's just flow. Let's just flow,
Okay.
and we'll
I was
get
also
we'll get to
reading
that
how you
later.
structure this too. And I was like, I think it's very fluid. It's very
Yeah.
fluxy, as I would say. So maybe
Yeah.
I just go with it. But your 15 years, what were you doing during that time that you were traveling, and how did that get started?
Yeah. It's a great question. Let's see. I think on the macro level, so I went to Stanford and I studied math and philosophy,
Mhm.
basically. They were both interdisciplinary versions of those things.
Mhm.
But then when I left, I realized, and I got involved with all these protests, kind of activist movements at the end of Stanford, and it kind of broke my whole interpretation of the world of like, oh, I really worked hard and I got to go to this good school because I was such a good student. And that whole thing of all of the injustice and the luck and the
Mhm.
privilege and the good fortune, all that kind of came online for me in this awareness that I had not had before that.
Mhm.
And something about that was like, you need to go and learn all the things that you by definition can't learn here. So you're in this amazing ivory tower, right? This box of learning. But what are the things outside of that? So most of what I spent the next 14 years doing was organic farming and natural building, meditation, music, traditional medicinal and herbal knowledge, just like all the maybe folk knowledge is a way of putting it, but
Indigenous,
also,
and I would
hmm?
say most important, indigenous and powerful.
Yes, all,
Yeah.
all of that. And it was like,
Like,
oh, I got my like real, in a sense, my real education, but I don't want to dismiss what happened in the ivory tower either. It's like more like I complemented that education, and my real education was the ensemble, right?
yeah. Wow. Now this is totally, well, there's another piece around this that I'm like, oh my gosh. So I'm doing a lot of work. One of the chapters, one of the superpowers, the 8 Flux superpowers, is this idea of how we see our careers. And
Okay.
this idea that your career is not a path. It's not a linear path to pursue. It's not a ladder to climb for sure. It's what I call, and this is more looking towards the future of work, but when I hear stories like yours and even my own, I was trying to define what is it that I'm trying to do for 25 years, but we just have the ladder, we just have the path, we just have that kind of one directional, very binary way of often seeing professional identity. But the way that I term it is it's the era of career portfolios. And so curating, rather than climbing a career ladder, you're curating your career portfolio. And when I hear your story, I'm like, yep, you had a portfolio much earlier than most. Now, whether we talk about it as what's happening now is we finally have a shape to talk about it. And you think about the Great Resignation, you think about quiet quitting, you think about layoffs, right? All of these instances in which our professional identity and what is purpose and what is success and all of that. And then you think about how much trouble we get ourselves into when we follow that ladder analogy, right? And more people are saying, I don't want to be on the ladder, particularly the ladder that someone else built for me,
Right.
for me to climb, as opposed to, am I the author of my own life? Am I the designer of my own ladder? And a lot of people saying, I don't want a ladder. I would like a jungle gym. I would like a lattice that I can climb up and around and, sideways and whatever. And so the portfolio I like because it's like, you can think of an artist portfolio, you can think of an investor's portfolio, but it's this much more holistic notion of what is it that you do and what kinds of gifts and contributions can you bring to the world? So that part is quite fun. And then separately, I had my own, I think, journey of exploration. Didn't do it. You said 15 years, 19 years? What was it? Long.
I think 14, 15, something
14.
like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mine was not nearly that long. But when my parents were alive, they were both public school teachers. So not a lot of like money or anything like that, but a big emphasis on education. And with my dad in particular, as a cultural geographer, a big emphasis on travel, cultural diversity, seeing like that the world is bigger than your own backyard.
Yeah.
And so when they died, my plan was to like follow in sort of kind of their footsteps and do my PhD and become an academic and that blew everything to smithereens. The experience of losing them and realizing that I could die tomorrow, we all could die tomorrow, and like, what was I going to make of the time that I had? And I too realized just how little I knew of how the world actually worked.
Yeah.
And 20 was a really interesting age, right? Because I was old enough to be living away and know how to take care of myself day to day. And I had zero sense of how things actually worked, right? Or what I could contribute. And so I actually was supposed to do my PhD at Stanford. And after graduation, I had a Fulbright for a year, which was terrific because it taught me that I wasn't ready for grad school or a PhD or anything like that. And so the week before I was supposed to show up, I had to send that email saying like, it wasn't the week, it was the month before. But it was the week before I was leaving to travel, before I was supposed to land on campus. And I had to tell them like, one, my heart's not in this, but B, you're not getting the student that you think you're getting. Like I have to decline. And the whole notion of like, so what is your, like my extended family who were rightly concerned about me, they were like, okay, so you're not going to go do your PhD. They're like, what are you going to do? And I was like, and I was 21 at this point. I was like, and again, the things that you can be possessed to do when you're in that state of, I just don't know. And it takes courage, but also I look back and I'm like, wow, how did I do that? And there's something, the inner spirit coming alive. And I was like, my plan is not to have a plan, at which point everyone goes, oh no. I said, you have my commitment. In my case, I had made a commitment that I would go to grad school. Grad school isn't for everybody, but I was like, I am going. I don't know exactly in what. I'm interested in global development. I'm interested in a lot of these issues around access to finance, access to opportunity, access to like, again, these issues of privilege and giving voice to people who haven't had voice, opening opportunity to people who should have it, but because of how we've designed so many of the systems in the world, don't. And so I began to travel. So the funny thing was losing both parents. Here I'm in my early 20s. I have I have lots of energy, like I'm healthy, I have lots of ideas. I have to be accountable to myself. I don't have a backstop, right? You lose your parents, like I got to take care of myself. There's no one that's going to there's no home to go home to, right? So I had to be responsible. I couldn't like just, I don't know, fritter away my time, or like I didn't have anybody else's money to spend or anything like that. But I also had zero accountability, parental accountability. So like if I wanted to do something, there was no one saying, don't do it. And so I was like, I'm going to go figure out a way that I can see. My goal became, and I didn't do it for 14, I did it for 4. But for 4 years, the goal was how to see how as much of the rest of the world lived as I could, so that I could figure out how to serve best. And I would work and I would volunteer and I would do anything I could to keep that quest alive. And what I ended up doing for 4 years was I was a hiking and biking guide for half of the year.
Oh,
which
wow.
gave me enough income. And it was fun because I began in Italy, which is where I had my Fulbright and I speak the language on it. But then I was like in Patagonia and Vietnam and Morocco. And so 6 months of the year, I would guide these trips. And that allowed me to earn enough income, not to pay a mortgage and raise a family, but it earned, as you know, plenty of income to
travel the other 6 months.
Yeah. And so that's what I did. And that's during that time, that's when I was exposed to concepts like microfinance, which is when a big light bulb for me went off. Not that it's a holy grail or anything like that, but how much of the world is unbanked. That was something that, despite having studied international relations, no one had ever brought the like systemic issues of unbanking, underbanking, financial inclusion, that sort of thing. And started learning more about, how access to finance affects everything from access to education to access to maternal health care and water and sanitation and all these other things. And so it was during that time that I figured out what I was going to do at grad school, but went with a very clear mandate in mind. Now, in retrospect, I would have loved to, at that point, the indigenous wisdom, the kinds of trainings that are available to what today, and the kinds of initiatives, I think if those had been sort of on my radar, I would have maybe lasted for longer than 5 years. But nevertheless, I feel a real affinity for what you're describing here. It makes me really happy.
Oh, so I have 2 directions I want to pursue that are related to that. So I'm going to bookmark them. All right. And then we'll go to the first one. So I've had this problem my entire adult life. And my life has been, as you tell already, like very iconoclastic. It's like super different. I've done dozens of different careers, including like software engineer and hospice chaplain and, small peasant agriculture, like harvesting rice, all the wacky stuff. And I have this dread even now. So this is why I'm asking you. So even now, because this relates to your career portfolio concept, like people ask you, like, what do you do? And I've never been able to say anything. And like the closest I can get, like when I was clever as a younger guy, I would be like, oh, I just do something between the best I can and what needs to be done, but really I don't know. And do you have any wisdom?
And I won't. Yes, I have some solicited advice. It sounds like you are asking.
Oh, hell yes. Oh, yes. Coach away.
let me share a couple things. So I too struggled with this for 25 years, and people would be like, wait, you're a lawyer and you're global development and you're a hiking guide and you do handstands and you're an investor. Like, what do you do? Right. And I got flack forever. And I wish I'd had the word portfolio back then. Better late than never. We have it now. It is how I describe myself. But I want to put 2 things that come to mind. So if it's any consolation, I think I have a few years on you. And it was only a couple of years ago when I wrote this book, Flux. This is the first time in my life that I'm like, you want to know what I do? Read this. And now this is more of a me scenario. I'm going to come back to what's more universal. But it's fascinating because it's not one role. It's not one title. It is a theme I care about and that I believe adds value to people. So figuring out what is your theme, and then you're coming up with, whether it's a description. In my case, I joke, this book is a container for 30 years worth of doing, but it's not about any one role. And what I'm finding is it feels really good after 25 plus years of having to like cobble together some answer depending on who I was talking to and having people, raised eyebrows and this and that, to say, oh, here it is. Now, within the book, I mentioned this whole notion of career portfolios more broadly, and I can send you a couple links if you want and whatnot. We can put them in the chat. Here's the hook. I've worked with a lot of people and organizations who are like, they want to support this notion, they want to build a portfolio, but they're also like, how do I not do this and not look scattered? How do I not look unfocused, right? Like, you've done all of these things very intentionally, and how I suspect they connect in your mind, and one thing led to another. What's fascinating to me is that you can have, and here hypothetically, you have a candidate who's done 15 different things. They go up to 2 hiring boards, and you can think of hiring for a job or hiring for a fellowship or whatever the case may be, right? One committee can look at this person and their portfolio, their resume, and they can be like, wow, this guy looks totally scattered and unfocused, and why did he do all that? And right?
Yeah.
And another committee can read the same profile, the same portfolio, and be like, this guy is 1 + 1 = 11. This guy is off the charts. We will never find this many different qualities and skills and capabilities in one person. This guy came like amazing, like hire him, promote like in an instant and then some. What's the difference? Right? So you're like, what's the difference between those two? The difference is in your narrative. It's in, when I call it your portfolio narrative, but your ability to say, hey, everything from, I thought I was really going to like this thing over here. Turned out I didn't, but it taught me this, which led me over here. And while I was here, I was able to take the skills that I'd learned in that first instance and apply them in ways that no one had ever seen before. And when we did that, it opened this door, and I realized that, oh, over here is another community or another sector or another initiative that could use a new way of thinking, or that I'm really interested in because it's going to help me fill in some gap. I'm going to go over there. And so you're sort of peeling back the layers of your own onion to then recreate how it can help a given organization, a given topic, etc. And the hard part is like developing your narrative takes work, but that is like the secret sauce, where you've got your portfolio, but if you're connecting the dots to others, it does consistently, it's 1 + 1 = 11. Now, when it comes to taglines and what do you call yourself, like those 3 words that you call yourself, quite funny. I mean, I had to go through this myself, where in particular, around when the book came out, and it was like, well, what are you? Are you a futurist? Are you an author? All of those things we've heard before. And it was like, if I'm talking about how we navigate change, I'm a change navigator. Okay, who has that? I kind of go around. No one has that title right now. It works for me. It's like trying on clothes. I'm going to try it on. It fits for now. It may not fit forever, but I'm going to try that for now. And more recently, it's been the whole futurism, the future of XYZ. But a lot of times futurism, people assume that you're like rah tech, like a kind of techno optimist, which I'm not. I'm not a Luddite, and I'm not like anti-tech, but I'm much more of the humanist end of things. And so I now will describe myself in the realm of futurism as a humanist futurist. No one else is calling themselves that. Fascinating. Okay. Just because no one else is, some people would say, oh, if no one else is calling themselves that, that won't work because people won't recognize it. I'm like, yes, they will, as long as they recognize the component parts. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but coming back to you, it's like, it is up to you to figure out what are the seeds, the kernels of insight, wisdom, the things that you're best at doing, and distilling those into a couple of lines. But the portfolio narrative will win every single time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think so personally for me, I have a good sense of that narrative, but the distillation process is something I've had trouble with.
And it's not easy, I will say. But this is where too, I don't know how you spend, like if you kind of whiteboards or Post-its or whatever, it's taken me years, frankly, decades. But what's lovely is that when you have a portfolio, it continues to distill. It
Hmm.
continues to evolve. And even though it's hard work, like finding that baseline, but then the understanding of like, it is probably going to update every year. And in the world of resumes and linear thinking, like, frankly, they've made it so easy that you don't have to think about it, right? It like you're lockstep. You get promoted after a year, after 2 years, like someone else is writing that narrative for you. So
Mm-hmm.
by default, your portfolio narrative, you are the author of it. It does take work, but at the end of the day, I mean, not to sound morbid, but like when you think about a life well lived, when you think about creating your own unique, authentic, whole life, who do you want to be writing that script? Who do you want to be writing that narrative? Like you do, actually, even though it does take a bit more effort.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. And that's a big part of my coaching in the last few years. And our whole thing is, it's like either you're writing the vision or someone else is. And if someone else is writing the vision, then you have like this really small part to play usually. And it's
Yeah.
just like,
You've been
okay.
assigned a role, and oftentimes you don't even realize you've been assigned it. You've sort of, again, put on those clothes without checking to see if if they fit, if they're the color you like, any of
Yeah.
that. And unwinding that is really hard. I think it's really scary for a lot of folks. But I look at it, and I don't want to sound naive, but it's some of the most, if we're talking about this in the context of work, it's some of the most important work you can ever do, right? And we spend so much time thinking about, and this is it's not a tangent, but it's an interesting side note. Like we spend so much time talking about in the context of change, for example, like what do we do about change? How do we manage it? What do we do? And I don't want to discount that taking action is important, but if you haven't actually done that inner work of who's writing the script, like who am I? Whatever you're going to do is a direct result of that. So let's stop putting the cart before the horse,
Yeah.
and reshape, recalibrate that dynamic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm, beautiful. Okay, I just want to say one thing that I normally say at the beginning, which is that we can use or not use anything we say. And so if there's anything that comes on that you're like, I don't want that aired, let me know. I just like to say that because I want to invite us to go into realms that we probably don't want aired. And so I just want to get into like the most real
Yeah.
questions about your actual human experience in this moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Ankur. And I've how do I've listened, I absorb, and I thank you for that. And I will let you know. My baseline is that I'm a totally open book.
Yeah.
And I've often had people go like, whoa, you're willing to go real. I'm like, yes. If I'm going to walk the talk, and if I'm going to try to help others work their way through, like, what do you do when you don't know what to do? A, I need to be able to go there. And B, it's funny, people will often say like, oh, you wrote a book about this, you must be really good at it. I'm like, I'm exhibit A for this stuff. Like, this is not easy. I can share with you, I'll be really raw and open about what I've learned and how I am in a much better place now than I was 10 years ago, for example, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But insofar as we are living and breathing on this planet, we will be encountering more change. We will be encountering more difficulty. We will be encountering more situations in which we don't know what to do. And so that requires just me being open. Now,
Yeah.
I would love, oh gosh, I'm somebody that when I stumble into a conversation where I'm like, whoa, didn't know we'd go there, I have learned to relish that. Now, if there is something that I'm like, let's take that out, that for me is like a wonderful sign. It's not a
Yeah.
sign of like, oh crap, what did we do? How did I say that? It's like, we broke new ground. We
Yeah.
broke new ground that's maybe a little too raw or a little too, I don't want to say unvarnished because I'm fine with unvarnished, but a little too, it goes back to what I was saying about after my parents died, that there were many years in which people would say, hi, how are you? Who are you? And I would be like throwing a hand grenade into a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
And I want to avoid that because that I've learned is not good for anybody.
Yeah.
But we'll see how this goes.
Cool. Cool. Because the next thing I wanted to ask was, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, obviously your parents died at a young age. That has a huge effect on anybody, even at any age, really. And this presence, this awareness of death, and the relationship of that awareness of death to what you're doing, what you decided to do at that point.
Yeah.
If you tune into that right now, how does that, is that awareness still there? And how does that guide what you're trying to do?
It's a beautiful question. So yes, and if we go back just a little bit more context on that experience, because I don't think, when you're in the moment, you're not processing everything fully. You're just trying to put one foot in front of the other. And it takes years to like peel back the different layers. But one thing that I do remember remembering or realizing it shortly after they had died, putting all the pieces together, was that when my parents died, I was 20. So I wasn't 8. I wasn't 3. I was young, but it was losing both of them at once, which was kind of the double whammy. But when they died, I had never been to a funeral before. I had never experienced death. My grandparents were living, which was a huge blessing. I didn't know what death was. And so I bring this up because my experience was like going from 1 to 100 and then like throwing myself off a cliff, like in one fell swoop, right? That the first funeral is the funeral of both of your parents, and my sister and I, like, we buried them with our own hand. Like it was like that physical experiences of putting them, they were cremated together, but like to do that together was like, wow. And I couldn't not be present. Like I was so raw. It was unfiltered, unvarnished. And so there was a kind of presence then that was related to a different kind of presence that I started to discover shortly thereafter. And now they died pre-Facebook, the internet existed, but social media did not. So I was not having to post everything online. I was not having to grieve publicly. I was very open about the experience, but I've given a lot of thought to it since then, because what I learned, or what I committed, I think, to myself subconsciously, if not unconsciously, was that I was not going to hold anything back. And what I mean by that was I was not going to hide my grief. I was not going to say that things were okay when they weren't. I was not going to grieve the way society thought you should grieve. I realized there was no playbook for it, but that I was going to feel everything 100%. Now, where that comes from, that sense of like, the only way out is through, and I can't, pardon my speech, I can't half-ass this thing. I have to go through it, because I think if I don't go through it, it will continue to plague and fester and like sit hidden in a corner of my heart and my brain until I do.
Yeah.
What possessed me to do that is partly remains a mystery to me. Partly it was being raised with a very high connection, a high sense of connection to my emotions and being encouraged to share my emotions. But when I fast forward, it gave me such a clarity of presence at that time that I hadn't experienced before, and that I realized I didn't want to get let go of. I didn't want to put that back in some kind of bottle after getting through the immediate aftermath. And that doesn't mean wallowing in one's grief. That means staying present with that sense of clarity. You can sometimes, I think over the years, it has also felt like intuition. It has also felt like a sixth sense of knowing what to do, even when there's no guidebook or answer, or like you don't know what to do, but your inner spirit says, this is what you need to do. And I've come to think of it as a kind of, it's a mental muscle. It's also an emotional and a spiritual muscle. And the only way that you keep it alive is if you practice it. And so to your broader question, it definitely has not been always around issues of grief and loss and struggle and challenge, but trying to practice that muscle of intuition, that muscle of trusting myself, which is a lot of what it comes down to, and that muscle of showing up, even with the tough, messy stuff, showing up fully, that sense of rawness, and that being raw is okay. That is something I've tried to carry through my life. It hasn't always been right there at easy grasp, but it is something that I know for sure I wouldn't have if I hadn't practiced it. And that also I wouldn't have the closeness of connection had I not gone through that initial challenge, if that makes sense. So kind of looking at something really tragic that happened and then being able to see all of the quite amazing, even marvelous, magical things that happened because it did.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder, maybe I'll share a little story as preface here. So the other day we were driving somewhere. I have a daughter, five and a half year old girl. And I was driving with her and my father-in-law, my wife. And she asked something about when I was going to die. And because we're open about death, and I'm like, I'm most likely, and I hope I die before you do. And it was a new concept for her that like I didn't know. And I was like, we all know, and she has like no concept about time. It, barely has a concept of like before versus after, like she's 5. It's like the world is entirely just magic in her mind. But I was like, yeah, we all know the day that we're born, but we don't know the day we're going to die. And that's something that it's present for me every day, especially because I've had loss, and she was in the hospital a couple of years ago and almost died. And so, especially since that moment, it's been like really a big part of my day that Jasmine could die any day, or I could die any day. And how is this going to affect my life? And I wonder, kind of given not just your parents dying, but since all your other experiences, like how often do you have that thought or that awareness that's true for all of us, and how does it guide what you're doing?
Oh my gosh, I love this. I love this question. And I feel like I just walked, like you just read, I don't know, you have your own, speaking of intuition, and like walking into a conversation that I delight in having, but also is just, I feel like so helpful for so many people on so many levels. And that is, how often do I have that conversation? How often do I ask that question? I can say without hesitation, every single day, and oftentimes multiple times a day. Now it manifests in different ways. And here's what I want to bring up. And actually more recently, I've been having this thread has come up in settings where I didn't see it coming, in particular, in the context of midlife. Now, this is fascinating. I learned recently, midlife is defined these days as between 35 and 75. So like, there are a lot of people, we are in midlife, right? And I was like, because depending on the day, I still feel very young at heart. Like the older I get, the younger I feel. And at the same time, like, look at the clock, like you're getting older. Like, but it came up in midlife. And I'll come back to it. I want to plant that seed. I'll come back to it in a minute. Because from the day, and truly the day that my parents died, I had this very real sense of my own mortality. I think in particular because I hadn't known death before. It was like, wow, that much can happen that fast without any agency. And like, they were young and healthy, and what? And could have been, it was them. It could have been anybody. Could have been me. Could have been you. Like, whoa, right? It completely messes with your mind, both rationally and irrationally. And so even throughout my 20s, I had the very rational yet irrational, but true, like fundamentally true belief that I did not have more than a year to live. Now, I was healthy. I didn't want to die, none of that, but I believed I didn't have long to live. And every year when my birthday would come around, I would be shocked. I never planned a birthday party because I was not going to live there. I was not going to be alive to have it. And every year I'd be like, oh my God, I'm still alive. And it was only when I turned 30 that I was like, maybe I make it to 35. I gave myself 5 years, right? Yeah. But so I had that piece, which is totally irrational, and yet grounded me in a way that I hadn't been grounded before, in terms of rootedness of like, so what are you going to do with today? And that was the question that I started asking every single day. And I mean, I can tell you, I asked it today. I asked it yesterday. I ask it every day. And that question is simply, if I were to die tomorrow, and now I don't intend to, I don't want to, I don't think it's going to happen, but it could. If I were to die tomorrow, what would the world, and so here, I mean, not my ego, not social media, not a boss. What would the world need me to do today? And that was a question I started asking. And it's funny because later in life, I've had people say like, oh, that's the kind of question that people are asking around midlife when they're going through some kind of crisis often of like, am I spending my life in the best way? They're like, you've just been practicing midlife for a really long time. And I love that because I'm like, for me, midlife is something to celebrate. I'm like, if we are blessed enough to outlive, like in my case, like I will touch wood. My parents died young, but I'm now at an age where like I can see, I know how old they were. They were young, but I'm not their age yet. My sister is like that date that you pass how old your parents were, that you're like, whoa. And I'm like, okay. So like every day you have after that is like, it's like bonus. It's like icing on the cake. It's like, there's nothing guaranteed. But I share this because it's actually asking this question, I'm discovering now completely unexpectedly. I think it's preparing me or has prepared me pretty well for midlife, but also it has grounded me in what do I need to do today? And what I love, if I can just share this, is that, of course, most days when I ask myself this question, it's like, what does the world need me to do? The world needs me to work, contribute to like, I don't say produce, but to like get things into the world, connect dots, help people, all of that. Every now and again, there are those days where it's like, if I were to die tomorrow, the best thing I can do today is actually reach out to all those people that I loved. The best thing I can do today is actually rest and care for myself. And like, so it doesn't have the same expectation of like, every day you need to get closer and closer to the top of the ladder kind of thing. Like it's a more holistic, like there are some days where the best thing you could possibly do is replenish. But if my bigger goal is to contribute to the world. So yes, that is a question I've asked for many, many years now. And it's had both expected and frankly, lots of unexpected, but really beautiful results as well. And I think for me, what I'm grappling with right now is like, oh, so, and no one knows how long we're going to live, right? But the idea on your daughter is very, very likely, again, we don't know, but like projections, extrapolations, longevity, 110, 120, like that's not out of the realm of what's possible for someone born today. Even you and I, centenarians are actually showing up on the census as a statistic now, like they are an actual number. There are that many of them. And you think about it and you go, wow, I do believe the sooner we can begin asking that kind of question earlier in life, not in a morbid, scary, dangerous way, but in a way that's like, how do I get a little closer to my better self and better self in order to serve others? The happier, more fulfilled life we're going to have. And hopefully the better off the world's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that before, that you've been practicing midlife. And there's this little paradox in there of, as I've gotten older, I'm 42 now, I think, oh man, youth it's like a superpower, it's amazing. I had so much youth for so long, and I still have a lot of it, but there's this I think maybe critical to my understanding of it at the moment is that not only does the youth have all that like power and energy and beauty and confidence and all that stuff, but it has no awareness that it's one day going to be over. And for me, like maybe that's like, I don't know what these social scientists say the beginning of midlife is, but maybe it's that moment where you realize, oh shit, like it's not going to be like this forever. and then it really, because then that awareness of temporality and mortality is like, okay, so it really does matter what I do today, because my capacities and my experience and it's all not going downhill. It's always changing. Some of it's going uphill, some of it's going downhill. I mean, there's like little dips and upside down U-shaped curves, but it's changing. And so it really matters what happens today, because this could just be the last day.
Yeah. Two things that come to mind real quick there. And also just thinking about like who might be listening and like what kinds of experiences they've had and so forth. So in my case, when I look back on youth, I'm like, well, at least, I mean, I can go back earlier than 20, but when I was 20, not that my youth, like technically I was still young, I grew up.
Mm.
There was no more, there was responsibility. There was a lot of fear. Yes, there was energy and there was health, but there was also like, I got to be responsible. Like, whoa, I am not ready for this. And so that changed. And also, and this is more of a, it's not a side note, it's a fun, like my parents had raised me to be independent, like to a fault, actually. And to the degree that when I was 7, they sat me down and they were like, you seem to like numbers and you've just learned how to add and subtract and multiply and divide. And like, you're good with numbers. Congratulations. You're in charge of your own budget for everything except for food and a roof over my head. But like, you need school supplies, you need a winter jacket, like it's on you. which didn't make me feel like I was a kid being taken care of anymore. It was like you're lurching into not adulthood, but you're lurching into responsibility. And so little did I know that learning financial literacy at age 7 and having several years of experience under my belt when they died, and I really did need to have that kind of responsibility, was a real blessing, a real gift.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes. And I will actually put a shout out here, even for your daughter. And kids are ready for this stuff so much sooner than we think. And also there's a big problem because if you look today, just financial literacy, keeping budgets, knowing how much things cost, all that sort of stuff. And you look at this also in the context of inequalities and all sorts of stuff. Schools are not teaching this. Schools are assuming that parents are teaching it. Parents are often assuming that schools are teaching it. In the process, no one is teaching it. And then we get saddled with debt and don't know how to. So I love it because experimenting, allowing kids that kind of agency and responsibility is such a great thing. The one thing not to do is to replace that or equate that or get that at all involved in conversations about love, right? That like money is not love. And if you can't, in my case, my parents did, I think, a lot of things really well. They did a few things not so well. One of which was they never, and again, it was never said, I don't think it was intended, but how it was interpreted to me as a 7-year-old was that if I couldn't find a way to pay for all this stuff, that I was not to ask them for money. They didn't really have my back. Now, what they said was, you can earn unlimited amounts of money and we'll help you do that. The market for 7-year-old labor, not that robust, right? But there was this notion. So how old was I when I started my first business? I was 8, because I was like, things cost money and I have to do something about this, right? But if they had simply said, hey, listen, we want to teach you this accountability. We want to teach you this responsibility. We want to help you figure this out. And if you can't figure this out, we got your back. You'll still have a winter coat. You'll still have, they didn't do that. So that's one thing, though, that just like shout out to all parents. So for me, this notion of youth, my youth did get truncated, no question about it. Now, I'm not going to cry over spilled milk. I'm not going to say that there are parts of my childhood that now in my 40s, I am actually reliving for the first time. And the running joke is that like this 7-year-old has made a resurgence in my life. I mean, she's not me, but she's a piece of who I am. Yeah. And so I'm actually uncovering a part of my childhood, which never got fully celebrated, and realizing that it's not the same as if you're like biologically 7, but you can still bring that child out. And I think a lot of people have buried that inner child. And I think that leads to a lot less playfulness, a lot less curiosity, a lot less fun, and uncovering that child's spirit is actually a really beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. And then the other piece was just around midlife. I mean, that's been the real surprise for me around. I hadn't thought about midlife. I was just happy to make it, I've never thought I would be older than my parents would be. And so now it's all this bonus, but this idea of something that we can practice, that we can, it's this question. I mean, back to the more we can ask this kind of question and do so not in a threatening way, not in a like, what have you done today kind of thing, but in that sense of imagine, I mean, again, in our 40s, like not even imagine having double the life you've already lived, right? Double plus. All of a sudden, and here, my brain is taking a little detour. Now think of this from the perspective of the ladder versus the portfolio. Imagine you have another 40, 50, 60 years, and I don't want to say to work, to contribute, to do stuff. I look at the portfolio, and that portfolio looks so much more interesting to a 120-year-old lifespan than it does to somebody climbing the ladder who's like, ooh, I'm going to be on this ladder for a really long time, right?
Yeah. I mean, that gets back to something else that, so I don't actually know what you mean by futurism. And I think of like Italian artists from the last century. So we can like,
Okay.
we can get into that a little bit.
Sure.
But my guess is that as things go forward, we're going to have less in the way of humans working for other humans or humans working for machines in this like jobby way. And it's going to be way more creative, entrepreneurial, design your own portfolio. This whole like ladder career path thing is going to be a metaphor that we just basically leave at the side, and that hopefully the coming education system will reflect that, and rather than prepare you to accept somebody else's notion of vision, like developing your own vision, and everything that we had to go through after school of learning how to find our own voice might be like the point of school, if there is school in that way. So what is that's just a little background. What is futurism?
You've just walked, there's a piece of what you said where I'm like, ooh, you already have the futurist mindset. So let's go, like it's perfect. In terms of you're describing what you would like to see, a particular scenario, and I'll come back to the concept of scenario. You've just described one future scenario for what education could look like. Now, I would say the education systems writ large, not just in the US, but around the world, are very, very, very far from what you've just described right now, unfortunately. But it is a scenario, it is a possibility. And unless we can imagine those futures, we will never be able to bring them into being. So with that kind of like placeholder, futurism, and it's lovely because yes, for many, I still do get questions every now and again, like crystal balls, like tarot cards, like what? I was like, no, actually, law degree, business degree, I don't know, but like that's not where you would typically find futurists either. It's a relatively new discipline as a vocation, even though the concept, the discipline's been around for a while, even if practitioners are kind of more of a 20th century thing, 21st century thing. So futurism, just very, very short and sweet. I help people and organizations better understand where the future is heading, like not next year, like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Beyond 20 years, you can go up to 50. It gets hard because people are like, I won't be alive then. So like get it to a generation where at least you can imagine your kids still being alive, right? What is on the horizon and how do we fit into it? And the difference, the work that I do, so I work with companies and governments and think tanks and financial institutions and startups and like education, like it's all fair game because there's the future of everything. There's the future of work, which is what a lot of people have heard about recently. There's the future of cities. There's the future of public health. There's the future of war. There's the future of education, like, right, fill in the blank. And as a futurist, you're helping guide, like, so keep in mind, when we say the future is this interesting kind of figment of our imagination. The future doesn't exist. By the time the future exists, it's the present. So what we're looking at, and so many people and organizations are like obsessed, addicted to wanting to predict and control the future, right? Yeah. And that's what, even before the pandemic, I think the pandemic has helped my work in that people go, oh, right, like we don't actually control as much as we thought. Interesting, right? But this notion of wanting to predict that it's this singular thing and it needs to go this way. And if it doesn't go this way, then all hell is going to break loose, or I'm not going to be, reach my goals or whatever. What we need to recognize is that there is no one future, right? But what we do have are many different possible futures plural, that we're all bringing into being every single day, whether or not we realize it. And so the goal becomes, are you doing today, are you contributing to the kinds of futures, plural, that you would like to see. Right. And so I can go down that rabbit hole. Maybe we can come back to it in a minute. But as a futurist and a well-known startup that I was advising for many years, I still remember because they were like, what do you do? Like, we know we need you, but what is it that you do? And they're like, oh, okay. You spend your time thinking about and researching and connecting dots around all of those things that we know are important, like our intuition, our sixth sense tells us are important, but we don't have time to look at them in our day-to-day. Like our day-to-day jobs are like consume every minute of our day. And even if we did have time, we wouldn't know where to look. And for example, in the world of futurism, a pandemic was not a surprise. We knew a pandemic was going to come, right? Like at some point, humanity knew that we were playing with wildfire. It's kind of like we know natural disasters, but we knew a
it's
pandemic
not the first pandemic that we've experienced as
precisely, but how quickly we forget. Yeah. But if you go back and you look at the last 20 years, all kinds of futures forecasts relate to, if there is a global pandemic, what would we do about it? But it was always this kind of pie in the sky. Well, someday maybe, and then boom, it happened. Now imagine if you actually had been doing what's often called scenario planning, scenario mapping, right? Forecasting these different scenarios and saying, well, and a tagline is often in futurism, shifting from what is to what if. What if this were to happen? Would we be ready? And so you think about, imagine if in 2019, you had already been thinking like, there could be a pandemic next year. What do we need to do today to prepare? Does that mean that you would have had some kind of, watertight strategy? No. But does it mean that you would have been better prepared for when a pandemic actually did hit? Yes. And so what I do is I help map out these different possible scenarios and just do a lot of it is custom to a given sector or a given company, a given initiative's needs, right? So I'm not an expert on energy. I have not spent my life in the world of whether it's oil and gas or renewables, like that's not my thing. But energy companies would still need to understand the future of work. The future, that's for their own team. That's for anyone they're going to work with. Like, are they prepared for that? They're often more focused on the reality, like the operations of their business. They're not looking at macro trends that could actually disrupt them enormously and their ability to succeed. Recently, I've been working in real estate, right? Real estate is a very weird place to be right now because we've seen office space flip upside down. We've seen residential real estate do all kinds of weird things. Are you in a city? Are you in the suburbs, right? And so I'm not an expert in how to build buildings or how to build houses. That's not my thing. But they are trying to figure out, how does the future of real estate intersect with how people will be living and working and traveling and raising kids or not, and looking at fractional ownership or not. And so it's bringing this holistic view to the table, even though I'm not the expert in their actual business. Mm-hmm. They understand that they need to better understand. It's like raising the headlights. They need to raise their own headlights as to what the reality of the world within which they'll be working in 5, 10, 20 years is. So that's what it is. So it's lovely because there are now a couple of universities that offer like masters in futures foresight. It's not something that I set out to do. Like, my goal is to be a futurist. It's a term that people started using. Other people called me it before I started calling myself that. But it really is. And what's fascinating, Ankur, is that it goes back to that dot connecting. And it goes back to, do you have experience in lots of different domains? It doesn't mean you're an expert in any one of them. But I often like to use the analogy of a lot of what I do is pattern finding and also translating. So am I the most fluent person in all of these different languages? No. Can I translate between them? Yes. And this is where the time spent in global development, hugely helpful. The time spent, my time as a lawyer, helpful because I speak that language, even though I'm not the best lawyer. Yeah. My time spent, right? So you get where this is going. And I even look at like your portfolio, your background. There are elements, the combination of what you bring to the table is greater than the sum of its parts. And a lot of that ends up over in the world of futurism, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. It's just the vocabulary is new to me, but it's similar. So I used to work at the World Bank
Yeah.
doing research for it's a department that's focused on disaster prevention and disaster reduction. And so I studied with this French researcher named Stéphane Algat, who was just an amazing mentor. And the whole field that he introduced me to is called um, decision making under deep uncertainty. And it seems very similar to this, but part of my interest is always in integrating different ways of thinking and using different tools from different areas. And so in this deep uncertainty world, like the normal way that people would deal with uncertainty in the development and engineering and corporate sectors is you take a record of past data, which is like how many earthquakes we had per year or how much rainfall, or if like you're going to build a dam, you're like, all right, how much rainfall was there in the last 100 years? You use that to build a predictive model. And then based on the results of the predictive model, you're like, okay, the dam should be this big. And that way it'll get the amount of water we need and there'll be enough rain to support it. But then, boom, 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 uncertainty, more than just the stochastic uncertainty of what rainfall was. And all of a sudden, with like all these different climate change models, and nobody knows which one is right or if any of them are right, then you're like, well, shit, how do we build this dam? And then the scenario planner comes in, like, and they're like, you have to think about all the different scenarios, which they do. But then they're still like, how do I choose between the different scenarios? If they're like, because these resource managers are like, well, if there's no probabilities, then they're all equiprobable. You know, that's like kind of the default human thing. And then we have to get to this dialectical synthesis of the gift of the scenario planning with some sort of criteria to make decisions amongst them. And it always comes back to this thing that you said, I think is really, it's just so fundamental, is like, what are our values and what is the world we're trying to create? You know, which is ultimately underlies any of these like large stakeholder processes, right?
Yeah, oh my gosh, I love this. So I've done a fair amount of work with the World Bank as external as well. And so I'm listening to this going like, wow, and I haven't done dams and building dams, but it's like, I could be a fly on that wall. I like totally like your description of the conversation and the dynamics, like spot on. And I will also say too, where there are different kinds of futurist specialties. For example, there are policy futurists. They focus exclusively on policy implications of X, Y, Z. Fascinating, right? There are those that focus on just strategic futurists, just strategy. Awesome. And again, not to sound, it's not all exclusive stuff. It's just like, what are the variations? Because I mentioned that I focus on like the humanist futurist, which means technology is not a given. It's not, and innovation is not inherently good and all the rest. It's like, how do we look at the blind spots? And so a lot obviously around like AI and chat GPT and all of that, like the future of that these days, right? Lots of potential upside, lots of potential downside. But I just want to bring up that there are also climate futurists, which I believe will be there. It will be its own discipline. It already is to some degree, but like that alone, because some of what we're looking at, so many people, and this is going beyond just futurism, but like this whole notion of if we can't measure it, we can't put it in a spreadsheet, if we can't place a probability on it, does it really exist? You know, this desire to fit the future into a spreadsheet, and this desire to like, if we have a box for it, we can account for it. And I don't mean to discount the importance of systems and processes and spreadsheets and all the rest, but also this notion of, and when we don't know when we will never have that one number, when we will never know, and actually I say this against the context. So here we are speaking in, April, and last week you might have heard of the flooding in Fort Lauderdale. I don't know if that made your news. Mm-hmm. I was in Fort Lauderdale. I was one of the people stranded at the airport. Took me 38 hours to get home. And I share this because that flood continues to be called a once in 1,000-year rainfall event.
Yeah.
Once in 1,000 years. And I'm saying, no, this is not once in 1,000 years. Is it once in 100? Is it once every 10? Is it once every other year? We need to stop, like when you look at language and the framing we use, that too, again, you can't put it into a spreadsheet, but it's a kind of futurism, like changing the narrative, raising some of the words that we are and aren't using. And also, I love what you bring up about the cultural component of this. And I've spent a lot of time back to the humanism piece. It's been, I mean, I have quantitative degrees. That's a language I'm comfortable enough speaking, but I find that more and more when we try to put things in boxes, we're actually, the things that really matter are the things we can't put a value on. What's the value of trust? Trust is going to get you further in any crisis than any amount. Actually, I think any amount of money, any amount, any trust is what matters. And trust, you cannot buy it. You cannot monetize it. You cannot outsource it. What do we put? Do we put a value on love? No, love will get you farther. And I don't want this to sound woo-woo, but like, I want to start having these conversations about what we are and aren't accounting for, literally and figuratively. And so in the humanist bent, a lot of my work has focused on how different cultures and different societies have seen change. How do they talk about it? What is the language they use? What are concepts and rituals and traditions they've developed to help navigate change? And not just today, but throughout, human history. That's where it gets really interesting too, because you realize there is a wealth of human wisdom when it comes to navigating the unknown. But by and large, when we try to react to change or manage change, we're operating with the tools that are in our own cultural silo. And that's not good or bad. That's just part of human existence. But if we could actually start connecting those dots and learning from other cultures, other ways of being around, how do we talk about change? How do we plan for change? What are the ways in which we learn to build stability to prepare us for times of instability? Because when you look at it, and here I reckon this might be interesting, this notion of like, where do we find certainty? And we're often looking for certainty in a number. I need to know that this quarter's number is going to be that number. I need to know that, you're going to be there at this time. And more we realize the things we thought we should look, the places we've been looking for certainty often don't hold it. But the places we can find, again, certainty, big picture, we can invest in relationships. We can build trust. When change hits, those are the kinds of certainties. I want certainty that to the extent you are able to help me, you'll help. And that to the extent that when you're undergoing change, I will be there to help you. That's the certainty. But we over-index on the stuff we can measure and quantify and put a price on. And we under-indexed on this sort of stuff.
Yeah. That's such it's just a pattern that keeps showing up for me. So one of the projects I do, I run this group coaching program called Momentum Lab. That's essentially, it's for entrepreneurs, but entrepreneurs that are really interested in a holistic way of growth. So they want to grow, but they don't want to have a divorce as they grow. They don't want to end up as an asshole. They want to make sure that they're still mission aligned. So that's what we do. And one of the exercises we give them is, okay, what's something that could change in your life by the end of this calendar year that would make the most impact? Like, what's something that if you had this impact, so many other ancillary benefits would come along with it? And, in developing this exercise, I think in my mind, it was going to be some kind of, we talk about all the different areas of life, the business, the financial, the vocational, the creative, physical, the body. But I figured it would be a financial goal or some kind of vocational thing. And in so many of the cases, it was a relational goal. That when you have people do real introspection about what's going to flip everything in their life, it comes down to relationships.
Yeah. And yes. And I would say trusted relationships. It is about relationships, but it's those relationships. And there's a lot of my work over time has focused. I'm not an expert on trust, but trust is this through thread. And when I look at what helps people and organizations and societies navigate change well over time, no single factor matters more than trust. And it's fascinating because when you think about trust, it's like one word, kind of talk about trust, like trust crisis and trust, it's actually a really rich, messy, not complex per se, but like robust theme to dive into, right? There's a kind of trust that comes from your head. Like, can I trust that you're going to be there on time? And there's a kind of trust that comes from your heart. Can I trust that you'll have my back if I'm having a difficult time, right? There's cognitive trust and emotional trust. There is trust of yourself. And this is where it gets fascinating. Like, we talk a lot about, can I trust other people? And for many people, the hardest person to trust is themselves. And then we got to start wondering, where does that come from, right? Yeah. Where does that come from? And then also looking at, thinking about your daughter, thinking about young kids, like, there is so much for adults to learn from kids about trust. Like, we are born into this world trusting. We are taught to mistrust. And so a lot of what I talk about, like, it's funny, I'm like, how much of this is us that we need to unlearn? It's not about what we need to learn. We need to unlearn these unhelpful dynamics. And I don't mean blind trust. I don't mean naive trust. And I don't mean that everyone is trustworthy, that there aren't bad apples, that everything's sort of kumbaya. Like, no, bad things can happen to good people. And it's not that you every time you trust that you're always going to get what you want. But we start looking into, how did we end up in this world in which trust is so important and yet so fraught? It's just so thin. And you start realizing that a big part of it, I believe, is that we have designed so many of our systems and institutions and companies from the basic assumption that the average individual cannot and should not be trusted. So we have designed most of society from the default setting of mistrust. And all of a sudden you go, if that's the case, and we're looking at a future of more change, more uncertainty, more cases in which we need trust, I look at this, and of everything, of all the different flux superpowers that I talk about, whatever, like, trust. If you don't have trust, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to navigate change well. So we look to the future and we go, that's what we need. And where is trust? Trust isn't bought, it isn't monetized, it's earned and built over time. It costs nothing to build those relationships. And so again, I think we're very much speaking the same language, but coming with different perspectives. If there's any one thing we want to invest in, it's those trusted relationships.
Beautifully put.
Thank you. Well, and it's interesting too, because I do want to put this finer point on, like, it doesn't cost anything. This is not about whether you're rich or poor, whether you're credentialed or not. Like, we all have the power and the agency to build trust and nurture trust and earn trust every single day. And I like that, because again, I don't want it to sound naive, but there's a real equalizing factor there. Every single person has the ability to do this on an equal footing with others. And I think, I mean, some folks have written treatises on, like, the currency of trust. And I do think that moving forward, not currency in that monetary sense, but like, people who have large reserves of trust are very, very rich. They're rich and wealthy, right? In the kind of currency that matters, and the kind of currency that will help us weather instability, weather unpredictability, weather that uncertainty. And it's fun to, I mean, you think about it individually, you think about it organizationally as well, right? In terms of where do you want to hang your hat or place your bet when it comes to future success?
Wow. So I feel pretty secure in saying thank you for this first conversation, and that I really hope that we have many more.
I hope so too, Ankur. Thank you so much. This is just a total joy and honor. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome, April. Thus concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes Show. On behalf of myself and Martine, my producer, thank you for listening. And if you never want to miss another episode, if you want to have transcripts of everything you've heard, if you want to be in delightful one-on-one communication with me, and you want to hear about upcoming live events, sign up for our newsletter. You can go to momentumlive.com/podcast and get all the information.